All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving into something that you might think is pretty straightforward, but it turns out there's a whole world of research behind it. We're talking about spelling. We're going to be looking at some of the key insights from research really over the last few decades, but focusing especially on work from the 1980s when there was a real surge in interest in how we learn to spell.
Yeah, it's interesting how this kind of got a renewed focus. And a lot of that was driven by the emergence of cognitive science. For everyone listening, what we really want to do today is give you a clear picture of some of the most important findings and the debates that were happening in spelling research during this period. We've gone through a huge amount of material to bring you the really key takeaways here. So we'll be exploring how spelling skills actually develop, what teaching methods have been shown to work, and maybe even more importantly, some that haven't. We'll also get into the relationship between reading and spelling, which it turns out is a bit more complex than you might think. And we'll even touch on how our brains might handle spelling in different ways and what happens when we see misspelled words.
Something that really struck me as I was going through all this research was just how many unanswered questions there are in this field. And even contradictions, like we have spell checkers now. So is being a good speller really that important? Or is it becoming less crucial? Is it its own thing, spelling? Or is it just part of writing and writing? It's kind of surprising that for such a fundamental skill, spelling didn't really get a lot of attention in research and instruction for quite a while.
It is interesting, yeah, and the research definitely reflects that. There was this sort of historical lack of a consistent approach, a really central focus. And you're right, it almost seems like it was an afterthought. I think I even saw one source that kind of said that, for a time it was viewed as kind of, well, less important than reading or comprehension. But I think the research that started coming out, particularly in the 80s, really started to challenge that view. And it showed us that there's actually a lot more going on cognitively with spelling than we might realize.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how we actually develop the ability to spell. One of the things that came up a lot in the research was this idea of developmental stages in spelling. Can you sort of walk us through what that means?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the older way of thinking about it was pretty simple, right? Kids could either spell or they couldn't. It was very black and white. But what we see in the research is this shift toward the understanding that spelling skills actually develop in children through a series of distinct levels or stages.
Right, and there seem to be 5 main stages that were identified. Maybe we can just go through each one. So the first stage is called the pre-communicative stage. What's going on with spellers at this point?
Okay, so this is the very earliest stage. You often see this in preschoolers. And it's really all about exploration. It's about kids experimenting with letters and symbols. They might recognize some letters, but they don't really have a grasp on the idea that letters represent specific sounds. And they haven't quite figured out that in English, we write from left to right. You might see them mixing upper and lowercase letters, sometimes even throwing numbers in there. It's very random. It's not systematic yet.
Right, so that makes sense for that age. And then we move on to the semi-phonetic stage, which is often around early elementary school. What are the key advances here?
Okay, so this is where some important things start to click. Kids start to understand that certain letters go with certain sounds, and they begin to write from left to right consistently. Their spellings are still usually very short, like 1 to 3 letters long, and it's very common for them to use a single letter to stand in for a whole word, like they might write R for R or U for U. So they're starting to think more systematically about how sounds are represented, but they're still a long way from conventional spelling.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, even just thinking back to when my own kids were learning to spell, you see these patterns, like you said, using R, or for a while, my daughter spelled love as L-U-V, which makes sense phonetically. So it shows they're starting to grasp these sound letter relationships.
Absolutely. That's a great example. And that kind of spelling is actually a really positive sign at this stage. It shows they're engaging with the sounds of language and trying to make sense of how they're represented.
So then we move into stage 3, the phonetic stage, which is often around middle elementary school. They're really starting to make those sound letter connections more solidly now, aren't they? Like if you see a child spelling said for said,
Yeah.
they're understanding the basic sound, even though they haven't quite grasped the irregular spelling yet.
Exactly, exactly. So in the phonetic stage, what we see is a much more consistent attempt to map sounds onto letters. They start to figure out things like prefixes and suffixes, and they start to understand how to spell different forms of words, like for tenses or plurals. They're also starting to understand the concept of silent vowels.
Yeah.
And they're even figuring out how to spell base words, compound words, and even homophones, which is pretty impressive. However, at this point, they're really still focused on spelling words as they sound to them. They're not really paying attention to all the sort of quirky and complex rules of English spelling.
Right. They haven't quite internalized all those exceptions and inconsistencies yet. So that brings us to the transitional stage, often late elementary or early middle school. What's the big shift here?
Okay, so in this stage, their understanding of spelling rules really starts to develop more fully. They become aware of things like when to double consonants. They start to recognize common vowel patterns, especially in stressed syllables. They start to pay attention to how the stress in a word affects the vowel sounds. And the really big thing here is that they start to see the underlying structure of English words. They get the idea that vowels are usually in every syllable. They learn about the placement of nasal sounds before consonants. And they figure out the role of the silent E at the end of words. And importantly, they start to develop a visual memory for how words look. So they're not just relying on sound anymore.
So they're starting to move beyond just that phonetic approach and really seeing the word as a whole visual unit. And finally, we reach stage 5. What does a speller at this level look like?
So this is where it all comes together. Students in this stage have a really deep and kind of internalized knowledge of English spelling patterns. They understand the difference between silent and sounded consonants. They've got a handle on vowel and consonant alternations, like in compose and composition. They even recognize the influence of Greek and Latin roots on spelling. They have a broad understanding of all the different parts of words, prefixes, suffixes, contractions, compound words. And a key indicator here is that they can often recognize when a word is misspelled just by looking at it. It just doesn't look right to them, even if they can't specifically say which rule has been broken.
Now, the research mentioned Gentry's 10-word test as one way to get a sense of a child's developmental level. Can you explain a little bit about how that works and what some of the limitations might be?
So Gentry's test is basically about looking at the specific types of misspellings a child makes on a set of 10 words, and then using those errors to try and figure out where they are in their spelling development. And our sources use Monster as an example. They showed how at each stage, the spelling of that word might look very different. You might see something like, I think they said BTB pay in the pre-communicative stage, and then it progresses to MTR, then Moster, and finally Monster in the transitional stage. Now, the limitation that the research points out is that there aren't really any clear-cut, objective criteria for saying definitively that a student is at a particular stage. It does rely a bit on the teacher's judgment and interpretation.
So it's more of a guideline, a way to see those broad patterns rather than a precise measurement tool. And while there seems to be general agreement on these 5 stages and that kids move through them in a predictable way, there was some disagreement in the research about what this actually means for how we should teach spelling, right?
Right, exactly. So there were proponents of this developmental model, like Gentry, who initially suggested that direct instruction in spelling, the kind of formal teaching of rules and lists, might not even be necessary, especially in the early stages. The idea was that children would just naturally pick up spelling as they were exposed to more language through reading and writing. But other researchers, like Henderson and Templeton, felt that teachers needed to play a more active role. They argued that instruction should be tailored to the child's specific developmental level to help them move through those stages. And there was also debate about how kids best gain experience with spelling. Henderson and Templeton thought it was primarily through reading, whereas Gentry really emphasized the importance of lots of writing practice.
So there was this question of is it more about just seeing the words or actually having to produce them? And it sounds like there's not a definitive answer there.
Yeah, and that's something that the research really highlighted, the need for more research to really back up the practical implications of this model. Because while it's useful for understanding those developmental stages, it doesn't necessarily tell us exactly how to teach spelling most effectively. A lot of the research on this model was really descriptive. It was more about observing those patterns than about doing controlled experiments to compare this approach with traditional teaching methods over the long term.
So it gives us a framework, but there's still a lot of holes in terms of the specifics. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about those more traditional ways of teaching spelling. Like a lot of people listening probably remember the classic Monday list, Friday test approach. What does the research tell us about how effective that method actually is?
Yeah, well, I think the research from this period was pretty clear. Despite the fact that it's been used for, well, probably forever, the Monday list, Friday test approach is not a very efficient way to teach spelling. especially for kids who struggle with it. And there was actually older research that already kind of suggested this, but the work from the 80s really reinforced that. Interestingly, the research suggests that what they call a test study approach, where you actually test the kids first to see which words they don't know, and then they focus their study efforts on those specific words. That tends to be much more effective. But I think the reason why the traditional method persists is because, well, it's easier for teachers to manage. It's familiar. It's just what's always been done.
It's amazing how those less effective practices can become so ingrained just because they're familiar or easier.
Mm.
The research also touched on the fact that, well, let's be honest, learning to spell can be pretty boring for kids.
Yeah, it can be. And the research acknowledges that. Just rote memorization of lists of words is not very engaging, and it often leads to kids just feeling negative about spelling altogether. I think one researcher even said that, maybe spelling is the only subject where teachers feel like they have to resort to all these gimmicks to try and get kids interested, which is why a lot of the instructional strategies that we see, both traditional and more innovative ones, really try to make spelling more engaging and relevant to kids' lives.
It makes sense, No one wants to just sit there and memorize lists. And it's interesting that you mentioned that a lot of the spelling research was actually focused on students with learning disabilities.
Yes, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First, spelling difficulties are common in kids with learning disabilities, so it's an area where there's a real need for effective interventions. And second, I think the effects of different teaching methods are often more easily observed in this population because those challenges are more pronounced.
Right, so they provide a good kind of, well, testing ground for different approaches. And, this might seem radical, but there was even debate about whether formal spelling instruction is actually even necessary at all.
There's this whole discussion about the value of explicitly teaching spelling rules and word lists. Some argued that it's just a trick, just a matter of getting the letters in the right order, and that overemphasizing it might actually hinder kids' writing fluency and creativity. And when you combine that with the fact that young children often find it really difficult to memorize spellings, it's not surprising that some teachers, particularly in the early grades, would choose to avoid explicit spelling instruction altogether.
So it's this idea of, is it better to let them just experiment and express themselves freely and then worry about the mechanics later? It's interesting. And even among teachers who did dedicate specific time to spelling instruction, there seemed to be a lot of variability in their understanding of what methods were actually effective.
Yeah, that was definitely something that came up in the research. When they surveyed teachers, they found that there wasn't always a lot of consistency in their knowledge of different spelling instruction techniques. And sometimes the practices that teachers reported using didn't really align with what research suggested was most effective. And there was also some evidence that teachers might sometimes opt for methods that were easier to implement, but maybe not as impactful, potentially because of time constraints or just the pressure of having to cover so much material.
Yeah, it makes sense. Teachers are pulled in so many directions. And, something else that I thought was interesting was the research on those commercially produced spelling materials, like the workbooks and textbooks that are widely used.
Yeah. The research had some pretty interesting critiques of those materials. They found that while most textbooks did include a core set of common words that most kids need to learn, there was a lot of variation in the less common vocabulary they included. And while they often talked about the importance of understanding spelling principles, they didn't always provide enough opportunities for kids to practice applying those principles in a variety of ways. And there was this critique that a lot of them lacked really engaging, real-world types of activities that would challenge kids to really think about spelling. And they relied too much on just simple copying exercises as a way to promote memorization.
So they weren't really pushing kids to engage with spelling on a deeper level. Based on all this research, what are some of the better ways to introduce new spelling words? Like, should teachers be giving students long lists or breaking them down into smaller chunks?
So the research from this period really strongly suggested that breaking those long weekly spelling lists into smaller, more manageable sets for daily study, that is significantly more effective, especially for kids who struggle with spelling. There were multiple studies that showed this. That kind of distributed practice approach led to better performance on those weekly spelling tests. And one study even found that while stronger spellers, they seemed to do okay with either large or small lists. But weaker spellers really showed a significant benefit from studying those smaller daily sets of words.
Yeah, I mean, that just makes intuitive sense, right? It feels less overwhelming. But the research also kind of cautioned against jumping to conclusions about why this approach is more effective.
Exactly. It's hard to say for sure whether it's simply because they're studying fewer words at a time or because that study is spaced out over several days, which allows for that, well, that repeated exposure, spaced repetition, which we know is good for learning.
Hmm.
And there's also the factor that if you're studying daily, the time between your last study session and that Friday test is naturally going to be shorter than if you tried to cram the whole list on Monday. So, that shorter retention interval could also be playing a role. And the research suggested that to really tease apart these factors, they'd need to include longer-term follow-up tests to see how well kids retain the spellings over time.
Right, because ultimately what we care about is not just passing the Friday test, but actually remembering those spellings in the long run. And what about the amount of time that should be devoted to spelling instruction each day or each week? I imagine that's always a bit of a balancing act for teachers, right?
It is, and the research did offer some general recommendations, but it's really important to note that these were largely based on expert opinion and what was considered common practice rather than, rigorous controlled experiments. Some sources suggested somewhere around 60 to 75 minutes a week total, which breaks down to, 10 to 15 minutes a day. Others recommended just a flat 15 minutes every day, or even a maximum of 1 hour per week total. So there's some variation there. But I think the key message is that these should be viewed as guidelines, not hard and fast rules.
So, using your professional judgment and taking into account the specific needs of your students. Now, the research also talked about this idea of a student's spelling level, which is not necessarily the same as their grade level.
Right, yeah. So there was this idea put forth by a researcher named Schlegel of distinguishing between a student's instructional level, where they can spell, say, about 70% of the words correctly, and their frustration level, where their accuracy is much lower. And the idea was that students at those different levels would need different approaches, different word lists that are more tailored to their abilities. Later research actually refined that a bit, and they suggested that the frustration level might actually be closer to 50% correct, depending on the types of errors the student's making. But regardless of the exact percentage, I think the general consensus was that students who are really struggling, who are down at that lower level, they likely need a much more specialized program, one that provides more instructional time, different strategies to really meet their needs.
Right, so it's not just about giving everyone the same list and hoping for the best. You have to really assess where they are and tailor the instruction accordingly. Okay, let's move on now to the importance of feedback in learning to spell. We all know feedback is crucial, but the timing of that feedback seems particularly important.
Yeah, absolutely. The research really emphasizes that knowing right away which words you've spelled incorrectly, that's really beneficial for learning. And with the traditional Friday test model, you often have that delay, right? You don't find out until later. But there were a number of studies that looked at techniques where students get feedback right away, immediately after attempting to spell each word. And this was shown to be very effective. And it wasn't just for kids who were having typical spelling difficulties. It was even effective for children with more significant learning challenges, like intellectual disabilities.
And what were some of those feedback techniques that worked best?
Well, the most successful techniques usually involve the teacher immediately giving the child the correct spelling after they made an error, and then having the child write that correct spelling down. And yeah, it is a little more time-consuming for the teacher, but the research indicated that it was incredibly effective in helping kids learn and retain those correct spellings over time.
So that immediate reinforcement, that immediate correction, really seems to make a difference. Now, there was also this interesting technique called imitating the error that came up in the research. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. So this one's a little different. If a child misspelled a word, the person giving the test would actually write down the child's incorrect spelling, show it to them, and then write the correct spelling right next to it. And then they would ask the child to copy the correct spelling. And there was one study that used this with a student who had learning disabilities, and they reported some success with it. It reduced errors, improved overall spelling quality. And the idea, I think, is that by seeing that direct comparison, the child is kind of forced to more actively process the difference between their attempt and the correct form. It's like it turns it into more of a problem-solving activity. However, they did mention that it's important to be careful with this approach because for some kids, constantly being shown their mistakes might actually have a negative effect. It might make them feel discouraged or self-conscious. So more research on this specific technique was recommended.
It's fascinating how those subtle differences in how you give feedback can have such a big impact. Now, the research also found that this immediate feedback might not be equally important for all learners, right?
That's right. There was a study done with college students, and they were asked to spell one-word answers to questions about an academic topic. And they were tested on a computer, and different groups got different kinds of feedback on their spelling. Some got immediate feedback, some got delayed feedback, and some got no feedback at all. And when they were retested later, there was no significant difference between those groups. So it seems like immediate feedback might be more critical for younger learners who are really in the process of acquiring those spelling skills. For adults who already have a pretty good grasp of spelling, it might not be as crucial.
It makes sense. They have that foundation already. Okay, let's move on now to how we actually learn to spell from a sensory perspective. It's obviously not just about hearing the sounds of words.
No, definitely not. The research really emphasized that it's this complex interplay of visual, auditory, and even kinesthetic information. And generally speaking, the visual and auditory are considered to be the most important, especially early on. But that sense of movement, the kinesthetic sense, when we're writing, that plays a role too, although maybe less directly. When kids are first learning to spell, that ability to connect the sounds of words with individual speech sounds or phones, that's super important because they're relying so much on sounding words out.
Right, but as we all know, English isn't exactly the most consistent language when it comes to how sounds and letters match up.
Exactly. It's notoriously inconsistent. And because of that, English is often described as being a very visual language, at least when it comes to spelling. And the research showed that good spellers, they tend to rely more on their knowledge of what are called orthographic patterns, basically how words look visually. Whereas poorer spellers, they tend to over-rely on trying to sound words out, which leads them to make errors with words that don't follow those regular phonetic rules. Think about words like said or though. They just don't sound the way they're spelled if you're just relying on your basic sound letter correspondences.
Right, you have to have that visual memory for how those words are actually formed.
Mm-hmm.
And that whole idea of having a strong visual memory for words, that seemed to be a really key factor in being a good speller.
Absolutely. And there was this suggestion that maybe some spelling difficulties might be related to a child's ability to form a clear, accurate mental image of how words look, of those letters in that specific sequence. Because the theory is that when we're trying to spell a word or check if the spelling is correct, we're kind of mentally comparing it to this stored visual representation. So researchers were even exploring the use of mental imagery training, especially for students who were good at sounding out words but had weaker visual spelling skills. And one of the techniques they talked about was learning 2 pronunciations for irregularly spelled words, one for speaking and one to help them remember the spelling, which focuses on the actual letter sequence.
And what did some of those mental imagery training programs actually involve? Like, what kinds of activities were kids doing?
So some of the programs would have kids really carefully observe and describe objects, really pay attention to all the little visual details. And then they would have to try and recall those details from memory. So it was about strengthening that visual memory in general. And then more specific to spelling, there were exercises where they would trace the letters of words, first on paper, then in the air, and then try to visualize that air tracing in their mind's eye. And they also really emphasized encouraging kids to develop that habit of asking themselves, does this look right, after they've written a word? And even that simple self-checking strategy was reported to lead to improvements in spelling accuracy.
Yeah, I still do that sometimes. I'll write a word, and I'll kind of just stare at it for a minute, trying to decide if it looks right or not. And it's interesting how all these different senses seem to play a role in how we learn to spell. The research even directly compared visual and auditory training methods. What did they find there?
So there was one study that used nonsense words, and they found that there wasn't really any significant difference between using visual repetition or auditory repetition as a training method. But then another study that used real words found that visual training actually led to better spelling outcomes. And there was a larger study that compared, they compared visual imagery training, auditory training, computer-based training, and kinesthetic methods. And they found that auditory training actually resulted in worse performance than the other approaches, which didn't really differ from each other. So that kind of led them to conclude that visual training is really a crucial component of effective spelling instruction. And one thought about why auditory training alone might be less effective is that it might not engage the learner as actively. When you're looking at something or doing something physically, it might just be more engaging for the brain.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about the kinesthetic sense? We often hear that advice, if you want to remember something, write it out. Does that hold up in the research?
It's tricky to really isolate the effect of the kinesthetic sense, because usually you have to present the word visually or auditorily before someone can write it. But while activities like air writing or tracing letters on a table, those are sometimes suggested as being helpful, some researchers actually cautioned against relying too much on them. They argued that because those involve such large muscle movements, it might not actually transfer very well to the fine motor skills needed for handwriting.
Right. It's a different kind of movement. Okay, so we've talked about traditional spelling instruction. We've looked at the role of our senses. Let's talk about some of the more innovative approaches to teaching spelling that were being explored around this time.
Yeah, so this was an area where researchers and educators were really starting to think outside the box, to move beyond just teaching spelling rules and word lists directly. And some of these newer approaches included what's called indirect instruction, which is basically teaching spelling through other activities like reading and writing, and then there was the use of computers, and then all these different forms of group learning. However, it's important to remember that a lot of these more innovative methods, they hadn't been subjected to the same level of rigorous scientific testing as some of those more traditional techniques. So there's still a lot we don't know about how well they work in the long run.
Right, so there's a lot of potential, but we need more research to really back it up. Let's start with indirect instruction. The idea of no direct teaching of spelling sounds almost radical.
It does, right. It seems kind of counterintuitive. But the thinking behind it is that since we usually encounter words in the context of sentences and passages, not just as isolated items, maybe just increasing kids' exposure to well-written material, maybe that's enough to improve their spelling. And the two main ways they explored this were through reading and writing.
So what about teaching spelling through reading? It seems like just seeing words in books, maybe that's not enough to make us better spellers.
Yeah, and some of the research suggests that that might be the case. While it seems logical that reading more would lead to better spelling because you're expanding your vocabulary and strengthening that visual memory for words, the studies that actually looked at this connection more closely, they didn't find a lot of support for that idea on its own. One researcher even found that when students were specifically told to pay attention to the spelling of new words while they were reading a story, they did remember those spellings better than students who just read the story normally without that specific focus. But even when they were paying attention, the overall accuracy wasn't that great. So it seems like passive exposure to correct spellings just through reading, it's probably not enough.
So you need something more active, more intentional. What about the other side of indirect instruction, teaching spelling through writing and specifically through this idea of invented spelling? That seemed to be a pretty hot topic in the research.
Yeah, it was a big one. And it's a pretty radical departure from the way most of us were taught to spell. The basic idea is that you encourage kids to write freely and often without worrying too much about spelling correctly, and you basically ignore those initial misspellings. The theory is that as kids get older and their understanding of phonics and language develops, and as they see more correct spellings through reading, their spelling will naturally become more accurate over time. They'll kind of self-correct. And as you can imagine, this was a very controversial approach. It goes against everything we were traditionally taught about correcting errors. But because it was gaining some traction among educators, researchers really wanted to look at it more closely and see, does it actually work and what are the potential downsides?
So if you're not focusing on correct spelling during these writing activities, how are kids supposed to learn to spell correctly? Like, what role does correction play in this approach?
So while they generally discourage direct, immediate correction of those misspellings during the initial writing activity, it doesn't mean that correct spelling is just completely absent. The idea is that you introduce proofreading and editing as separate stages in the writing process after the kid has gotten their ideas down. But you do it in a way that doesn't make them afraid to write spontaneously. Teachers might also edit student work for display, like on bulletin boards or in class publications. And sometimes they would actually include both the original invented spelling version and the corrected version side by side. And there's also this technique where they would make corrections on the student's paper, but not to penalize them, just to draw their attention to the visual difference between their attempt and the standard spelling.
So it's more about raising their awareness than about, punishing them for making mistakes.
Yeah.
And what about when a student specifically asks how to spell a word during one of these invented spelling activities?
So the idea is that you try to encourage what they call spelling consciousness. So instead of just giving them the correct spelling, you might ask them to think about the sounds in the word, the letters that represent those sounds. You're guiding them toward figuring it out themselves. The teacher's role is often described as kind of circulating around the classroom, offering support and encouragement, but generally avoiding giving unsolicited spelling help. And part of the reason for that is so that they can get a more accurate assessment of the child's actual spelling level. Even when a child directly asks for a spelling, the recommendation is often to gently encourage them to try it themselves and then praise their attempt, rather than just giving them the answer. And they also talk about using cooperative activities where kids work together to come up with spellings. They might write them on a board, even take a class vote on the best attempt. And the argument for that is that it encourages them to problem solve together, to think about spelling collaboratively. And there are other social techniques too, like having kids write stories together or working with older students as tutors.
So there are a lot of different ways to implement this approach. But despite all the enthusiasm for invented spelling, the research also pointed out some pretty significant problems with it and a lack of strong evidence to really support those claims of effectiveness.
Yeah, and that's really important to acknowledge. While there was a lot of anecdotal support for invented spelling, teachers saying it worked well in their classrooms, and there were also a lot of theoretical arguments that aligned with this idea of developmental stages, a lot of it wasn't really backed up by solid research. A lot of the literature was more prescriptive, just telling teachers how to do it rather than actually evaluating whether it was effective. Like, for example, you might see claims that kids were becoming really proficient spellers after only a year or two of invented spelling. But when you look closer, those claims often lack the kind of data you would need to be truly convinced.
Right. You want to see those controlled studies, those comparisons to other methods. And when researchers actually did try to evaluate invented spelling more formally, what did they find?
Well, one study that looked at kids generating invented spellings, they didn't really find any evidence that it actually improved their overall spelling ability, even though the kids enjoyed doing it. And there were some methodological problems with a lot of these studies, like letting kids choose the words they wanted to spell, which makes it hard to draw firm conclusions. But a big concern raised by more skeptical researchers was just the lack of well-designed studies that directly compared invented spelling with more traditional spelling instruction, to see which one actually led to better long-term outcomes.
Right. You need that head-to-head comparison.
Yeah.
So what were some of those specific objections and concerns that people raised about invented spelling?
Okay, so one of the big worries was that by constantly praising and accepting incorrect spellings, kids might be learning that accuracy isn't really that important. Like if you're just focusing on the content and ignoring the errors, when do they learn that spelling matters? And there was also this concern that it was a waste of time, that kids were spending all this effort trying to invent spellings that were often way off. And the fear was that they might actually be learning those incorrect spellings, which would make it harder to learn the correct ones later on.
Right, like in ingraining those errors. And how did the people who supported invented spelling respond to those criticisms?
So their response was often that spelling development, it's a gradual process, it happens naturally, and that trying to force accuracy too early, it might not actually be helpful in the long run. And they said that kids kind of intuitively understand that their invented spellings are temporary, that they're not meant to be permanent. And regarding that concern about learning incorrect spellings, they argued that as kids are exposed to correctly spelled words through reading, and as teachers provide edited versions of their work, they're constantly being confronted with the correct spellings. So any negative effects from the invented spellings are minimized. And some even theorize that the main benefit of invented spelling is that it allows kids to take risks with writing, to focus on getting their ideas down without getting bogged down in trying to spell perfectly.
So it's about fostering that fluency, that freedom of expression. But some of the researchers who were more critical of invented spelling, they kind of pointed out some logical inconsistencies in those arguments, right?
They did. One researcher,